Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. I'd like to thank CIGI's public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support in making the Signature Lecture Series a success. Besides the audience here, we also have a global audience watching on the live webcast. And following this evening's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either the live audience here at the mics at the sides, or if you're online in our chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to the moderator on stage. This evening, we take a unique look at how the Middle East has undergone and continues to see important changes. Over the past 2 years, countries in the region, from Tunisia and Libya to Egypt and Syria, have experienced historic internal struggles and upheavals for political change. But what of the ongoing changes within Arab societies not demanded by obvious revolution? Progress in the level of discourse within civil society and in the ways that men and women interact with one another are less immediately obvious. We're pleased to have as our keynote speaker tonight, Shereen El Feki. She's spent the past several years examining sexual attitudes and behaviors in the Arab world, attitudes closely linked to trends in religion, culture, politics, and economics. Dr. El Feki, who was born in the United Kingdom and raised in Canada, including living here in Waterloo region, is a writer, broadcaster, and academic who started her professional career in medical science with a PhD in molecular immunology from the University of Cambridge. She's an award-winning journalist with The Economist, a presenter with Al Jazeera English, and is vice chair of the UNs Global Commission on HIV and Law. Her new book, titled Sex in the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World, was published this month, and copies will be sold in the CIGI Campus lobby this evening. Serving as our discussant tonight is Dr. Besma Momani, CIGI Senior Fellow and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and the Balsley School of International Affairs. You may recognize Besma's name from her opinion pieces in the Huffington Post, Toronto Star, and Globe and Mail, or her regular appearances on CTV and CBC News as one of Canada's leading commentators on politics and economics in the Middle East. So now please help me to welcome our keynote speaker, Shereen El Feki.
Well, my thanks to Fred for his very kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank Rohinton Medhora and Colleen Fitzpatrick and their colleagues here at CIGI for inviting me to speak this evening. I've been on tour with my book for about a month now, and it's been launched in the UK and Australia and the US and Germany and Canada. And I've spoken at some rather unusual places during this time. In Los Angeles, I was on stage with a stand-up comedian at the Silent Movie Theater. Sex, humor, silence, the symbolism speaks volumes. In New York, I was in discussion with a former call girl turned novelist at the Museum of Sex. So I can tell you tonight, this is the most distinguished venue I've had an opportunity to speak in, and you're by far the largest audience. So my thanks to you here in the auditorium for taking the time out of your busy schedules, and also my thanks to everyone who's online. I greatly appreciate your interest. As Fred said, tonight has a special significance for me. This is my last event of my book tour, and it's fitting that it should be in the place where I started. I grew up in Waterloo, just around the corner from University of Waterloo. I went to high school here. I took classes at U of W and WLU. I have to say it's really good to be home. There are many people here in the audience tonight who helped me along my way, former teachers, friends, students, and I'd like to thank them. But in particular, there are two people I'd like to single out for mention, and they are my parents, Dr. Gamal and Mrs. Gwyneth El Feki. Dad, I know, ma'am, you can't stand very well, but my father, please stand. This book would not have been possible without them, and I don't mean that in the sense that I wouldn't have been possible without them, but really they were instrumental in their encouragement and their support at every step of the way of taking this book from a glimmer in my eye to something that you can actually buy outside if you'd like to contribute to the Distressed First-Time Authors Fund. Now, those of you in the audience who remember me from my youth when I was all bad hair and geek chic will appreciate how improbable it is that I should have written a book about sex, let alone sex in as far-flung a part of the world as the Arab region. To give you a sense of exactly how far I have come, let me read from the beginning of Sex in the Citadel. Sorry, we're having a slight problem with the visuals. Okay, great. What is it? 6 pairs of dark eyes stared at me, or rather at the small purple rod in my hand. It's a vibrator, I answered, in English, racking my brain for the right Arabic word. A thing that makes fast movements came to mind, but as that could equally well apply to a hand mixer, I decided to stick with my mother tongue to minimize what I could sense was rising confusion in the room. One of the women, curled up on a divan beside me, began to unpin her hijab, a cascade of black hair falling down her back as she carefully put her headscarf to one side. "What does it do?" she asked. "Well, it vibrates," I added, taking a sip of mint tea and biting into a piece of syrupy baklava to buy myself some time before the inevitable rejoinder. But why? How I came to be demonstrating sex toys to a coffee morning of Cairo housewives is a long story. I have spent the past 5 years traveling across the Arab region talking to people about sex, what they do, what they don't, what they think, and why. Now, depending on your perspective, this might sound like a dream job or a highly dubious occupation. For me, it is something else altogether. Sex is the lens through which I investigate the past and present of a part of the world about which so much is written and still so little is understood. Now, I grant you, sex might seem an odd choice given the spectacle of popular revolt playing out across the Arab world since the beginning of this decade, which has taken with it some of the region's most entrenched regimes in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen for starters, and is shaking up the rest. Some observers have gone so far as to argue that it was youthful sexual energy which fueled these protests in the first place. I'm not so sure. While I've often heard Egyptians say that their fellow countrymen spend 99.9% of their time thinking about sex, in the heady days of early 2011, making love appeared for once to be the last thing on people's minds. But I don't believe it was entirely out of sight. Sexual attitudes and behaviors are intimately bound up in religion, tradition, culture, economics, and politics. They are part and parcel of sexuality. That is, the act and all that goes with it, including gender roles and identity, sexual orientation, pleasure, intimacy, eroticism, and reproduction. As such, sexuality is a mirror of the conditions that led to these uprisings, and it will be a measure of hard-won reforms in the years to come. At the end of the day, if you really want to know a people, start by looking inside their bedrooms. Now, the Citadel, which gives my book its title, is an impregnable fortress, and it's a famous Cairo landmark, but it's also a metaphor. And it's a metaphor for the situation we're in the Arab world, and that the only socially accepted context for sexual life today is marriage, family-approved, religiously sanctioned, state-registered matrimony. Everything else is haram, forbidden, aib, shameful, a lexicon, an endless lexicon of reproof. The problem is that large segments of the population are now outside the Citadel in most Arab countries. And while this is recognized, societies are really at a loss of what to do with these individuals. Even for those who are within the Citadel, all is not well in the marital bed. Sex has become something you do, not something you discuss. And this is leading to tensions in the family, both in the bedroom and out. In Sex and the Citadel, I explore these tensions for a wide variety of populations. Career women, divorcees, unmarried mothers, sex workers, men and women who have sex with their own sex. And I'm sure Besma will draw out these details in discussion, and we'll be able to probe these issues further from your questions and comments later in the program. But given where we are, here in Waterloo, which is receiving students from around the world, I'd like to focus in my talk on one particular population, and that's young people in the Arab world. Now, just can we have a show of hands? Who here has a connection to the Arab world, either because you're from the region, you have a family connection, origin to the region, you have friends in the region, or you've been on holiday? Raise your hands. Okay, well that's an impressive number. Marhaba bikum, glad to see you here. For those who are perhaps a little less familiar with the Arab world, let me define my terms. We're talking about 22 countries and 350 million people. The Arab world is vast and varied. We have huge distinctions based on wealth between countries. We have rural-urban divides. We have tremendous religious diversity, ethnic diversity, and we also now have political diversity because countries are taking different paths through the uprisings that began this decade. Now, this diversity between countries is also mirrored by diversity within countries. So in a single country, you can have huge variations in attitudes and behaviors depending on your wealth, your education, or your location. All this is to say it's very hard to generalize about the Arab region. But for all these differences, there is one thing that Arab societies across the region have in common, and that is they are young. 100 million. That's the number of people in the Arab region who are between the ages of 15 and 29. They make up about a third of the population. If you put in the ones who are under 15, we're looking at 60–70% of the population in some countries. This makes the Arab world home to one of the biggest youth bulges on the planet. Now, Arab leaders have made a big song and dance over the decades about how important young people are to their countries and how they are the future and they are the key to development, and then they did absolutely nothing. And then young people in 2011 went and stole the show in the uprisings which continued to convulse countries across the region. In most parts of the Arab region, it's now back to business as usual, and elders are back in charge. But young people haven't gone away. They are still on the streets, protesting and in some cases fighting, and their problems haven't gone away either. And some of the most challenging of these problems are in sexual and reproductive life. Now, young people in the Arab world are increasingly educated. Literacy is at an all-time high, and in a place like Egypt, for example, about 70% of young men and women go on to high school or beyond. Young people in the region are incredibly connected to the wider world. If we go to some of the wealthier states in the region, in the Gulf, for example, they have near universal mobile phone ownership, they have internet access, and even where there are poorer populations, they're watching television. In Egypt, for example, young people watch on average about 2 hours of television a day. These young people have a lot of time on their hands. They are vastly underemployed. Youth unemployment across the Arab region is running at about 25 to 30%. This is one of the major drivers of the uprisings that we have seen. To put this another way, about 90% of all unemployed people in the Arab world are youth. And it's bad for young men, but it's particularly bad for young women. Less than a quarter of young women across the Arab region have jobs outside the home. Now, these and other trends are having a huge impact on the personal and public lives of young people across the Arab world, but I'm going to focus on just one aspect, and that's marriage. And it's neatly summarized by this protester in Tahrir Square. Translated, his sign says, "Go, President Mubarak, I want to get married." Now, I know matrimony might seem like an odd demand for a revolutionary, but it makes perfect sense if you understand what's going on in the Arab world today. The average age of marriage across the region is rising, in some places quite dramatically. If we look at Tunisia, for example, young men are waiting until they're over 30 to get married, and young women are in their late 20s. The reason for this delay of marriage is quite complex, but one of the main drivers is economics. Arab societies have opened themselves up to the full force of global capitalism, and I'm sure Basma has written extensively about this. And marriage, in particular, has become an exercise in conspicuous consumption. It is expensive to get married in the Arab region, so much so that even in the wealthier Gulf states, there are special state-run funds to help to get young people into matrimony. The reason it's so difficult and why you have to wait is twofold. One, the burden of costs on marriage due to societal convention, and also within Islam, men are prescribed to take care of their wives financially from the wedding onwards. So men bear the brunt of the costs of marriage. But as I've discussed, unemployment is a huge problem, so they can't afford to get married and they have to wait. Now, the problem in the Arab region is that if you don't get married, and this is especially true if you're a young woman, you enter into what could best be described as a state of suspended adolescence. It's what one American academic has termed waithood. Basically, you can't move out of your parents' home, all the more so if you're a woman. Even if you manage to persuade your family that you could move out, you find it very difficult in most capitals of the Arab region to rent a place as a single person. And in any case, you're probably financially dependent on your parents, so it's not an option for you. So you don't have much of a private life, you're not supposed to be having sex, and you're definitely not supposed to be having children. And what we see now is that the rise of Islamic conservatism in the region, most recently and most spectacularly with the ascent to political power of the Muslim Brotherhood and related parties across the region, this taboo, this emphasis on the citadel, sex and marriage, has really strengthened. So at the end of the day, what's a single Arab to do? This is a scene on the Corniche, the Nile Corniche in Cairo. And if you've been there, perhaps you will be familiar with it. These are couples trying to find some privacy, some time alone. It's difficult for young people. Now, trying to understand what's going on in the sexual lives of young people across the Arab world is difficult. I know, I've tried, in large part because it's hard for us to do that research. Very often, governments are reluctant for us to ask questions about young people's sexual lives. And if we do get a chance to do that, more often than not, the results end up tucked in a locked drawer somewhere. But in some countries, this research has been permitted. And there are some very interesting results. It's what I call the 40-80 gap. So in Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria and Lebanon, researchers have been able to ask questions of what young people are getting up to in their private lives. And essentially what they find is that upwards of 40% of young men, these are unmarried men, say they're having sex before marriage. It can go up to 70%, depending on where you're asking the questions and whom you're asking them of. What's interesting, though, is across the board, 80% or more of young women say they are not having sex before marriage. This raises the obvious question, who exactly are all these young men having sex with? The reality is that young women are highly reluctant to admit to sexual activity before marriage. And this has to do with Islamic prescriptions that enjoin both men and women to remain chaste before marriage. But the reality is that we're looking at patriarchal societies. And in a patriarchy, boys will be boys, and young men have a sexual life, and we turn a blind eye. This is not true for young women. Virginity is a huge deal across the Arab world. And you need to keep in mind that virginity is not a private matter. This is not a question of my body. This is a collective concern. This is the honor of my family, and in particular, the honor of my menfolk. And it has huge implications, and really quite tragic implications for young women, which perhaps Besma and I will discuss later in the program. So We know that young people are sexually active, but the problem is that they are sexually ignorant. Let me focus on Egypt for the moment. Sexuality education in Egypt could best be described, I think the technical term for it is a shambles. Education as a whole is a huge problem in Egypt, and it will be one of the major challenges to shake up the system in the years to come. But for most young people in Egypt, reproductive health education, as it is politely termed, is reduced to a single lesson in biology class on reproductive anatomy and some rather hit-and-miss information on sexually transmitted infections. But teachers are often so reluctant to present this class that they will probably skip it altogether, or if they do summon the courage to teach it, they'll send the girls out of the classroom. The upshot of this came home to me in a very graphic illustration. A young woman came to me. She is a student at one of Egypt's leading universities. She's studying commerce. And she asked me, Dr. Shereen, I have a question. I am newly engaged, and I want to know if I can become pregnant if my fiancé stands in front of the air conditioner. Right, well, on some discreet questioning, it turned out that the only lesson on reproductive biology this young woman had received was on plant biology. And she had conflated pollen with sperm. And she thought it was going to waft over and impregnate her. Now, we're laughing, but this is actually not a laughing matter because it's reflected in some really dire statistics in Egypt. In this national survey of young people I was involved in 2008, 2009, we found that really about 2/3 of young women were either shocked or terrified at the onset of menstruation. And when we asked young people if they knew the main ways of transmission of HIV/AIDS, only 3% could answer this correctly. Less than 20% of young men in Egypt are getting the facts of life from school, and it's less than 10% for young women. And I've got to tell you, parents aren't exactly a font of wisdom on these matters either. Most young people are operating on a don't ask, don't tell basis with their families. And things are not getting any easier in Egypt with the rise to power of Islamic conservatives. They prefer not to see sexuality education in schools. Their preferred method of communicating this information is either in the family or in what could best be described as the Dell school of sex ed. This is just-in-time delivery of the essential facts of life to engaged couples before their wedding night. One of the points I make in Sex and the Citadel is that it's not all about problems. Yes, we have a lot of taboo around sex in the Arab region, but we are not helpless and we are not hopeless. And there are innovators across the region who are trying to deal with some of these problems. And I'd just like to point out Lebanon. So if we're looking specifically at sexuality education, Lebanon is on the verge of introducing a national curriculum on sexuality education. And it's not just bare bones reproductive anatomy and physiology. They talk about contraception and sexually transmitted infections and even sexual abuse. And it's not relegated to a couple of potentially missable classes in biology, but it's integrated throughout the curriculum for students aged 16 to 18. Now, the reason Lebanon has been able to do this is that 15 years ago, it tried to introduce sexuality education, and it had a huge pushback from religious conservatives. This time round, however, they have talked to parents, they've talked to religious leaders, and they have got people to buy into this because people are concerned. There is a rising tide of sexually transmitted infections in Lebanon, and they see what young people are getting up to on the streets, in nightclubs, but also on their computer screens. That being said, there are still limits to what's happening in Lebanon. So, for example, the new curriculum emphasizes the dangers of abortion, because abortion in Lebanon, as in most countries in the Arab region, is illegal, except on a very limited number of medical grounds. They promote abstinence before and fidelity within marriage because it's a point of common ground between Lebanon's various religious sects. And when I asked the official at the Ministry of Education in charge of this curriculum whether they would be tackling the question of homosexuality, her response was, "Oh la la." And saying, well, you know, if young people raise it in questions, we'll try to encourage teachers to answer them, but it's not on the official curriculum. Lebanon is unusual in that the government is taking the lead, and quite frankly, in a number of the post-Arab Spring countries, we don't have stable governments that can really offer this leadership. But where it's not possible, NGOs, civil society is stepping in. One of the most innovative programs I've seen comes from Morocco. It's a program called Bila Harag, which means without awkwardness. And it's a really innovative system. It's a website and where young people can send in questions about sexual life either via the website or they can text them in, and then they can get responses via their mobile phones. And also there's a radio show which tackles some of these questions on air. It's DJ'd by a really hip doctor and his female counterpart. And the issues they're tackling are really front on. They're abortion, sexual harassment, and sexual disorders. And one of the most interesting aspects of this program is that it makes an attempt to reach out to LGBT youth. So those are young people who self-identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transsexual. The program has proved very, very successful. It attracts hundreds of messages a week, which just goes to show you that young people want to know. They are thirsting for this information. But the problem with this program, this wonderful civil society project, is that NGOs can find it hard to work still in the Arab world, harder in some countries than in others, and funding is forever tight. All these projects that I came across as I was traveling the region over the past 5 years were really the most impressive aspect of my work. And you find these innovators across the region, whether they're trying to find solutions in the miniature of their daily lives, or they are developing community projects like the one I discussed, or they're trying to change national laws and policies. And they include, for example, tackling the question of how to provide sexuality advice to married men and women, where the communication is so constrained, and in particular women feel very trammeled in their ability to find information and express themselves sexually within marriage, within the Citadel. There are these incredible projects which are trying to find space for unwed mothers. There are projects which are reaching out in the name of HIV to try to protect female sex workers from infection. And then there are groups across the region which are dealing with the incendiary topic of homosexuality. How do we find place for men and women who cross the heterosexual line in the emerging order in the Arab region? The challenges for these groups are enormous, but I can tell you that the costs of failure are just too high, and we see that already. This is one example. This is the estimated number of HIV infections across the Arab world. Now, you need to keep in mind that these are underestimates because of the way we measure HIV in the Arab region. The important thing is not the numbers, it's to look at that line, that steady upward trend. And even more dispiriting is what happens when we look at deaths. Again, an upward trend. And I have to tell you that there are only 2 parts of the world in which HIV infections and deaths are still rising, and the Arab world is one of them. If we do not overcome our taboos, if we cannot find a way to talk about sex, then this is a very, very dangerous journey that we are heading on. This trajectory is disturbing, to say the least. And it's not just in the question of HIV. We see the costs of inaction, the costs of silence, when we look at the rising tide of sexual violence, in some cases quite spectacularly, in the reports of attacks on female protesters in Tahrir Square in downtown Cairo. But there is a drip, drip, drip of sexual harassment on the streets, in the workplace, and in the home across the Arab region, which is increasingly coming to light. We can see it in the booming business of illegal abortion, which is what you get when you deprive young people of sexuality education and you deprive them of the tools to try to protect themselves, and you tell them everything is haram and just wait till you can get married, and what if they can't? In a place like Morocco, for example, there are an estimated 600 to 800 illegal abortions a day. At the end of the day, the key to social change in the Arab world is not revolution. Quite frankly, as Besma well knows, we're not even talking about revolution on the political stage in many countries. We haven't had a dramatic break with the past. And so if it's not happening politically, then sexuality is not going to change remarkably. The sexual life is like a tapestry, and it has myriad threads of past and present. And weaving a new tapestry is going to need a new pattern, and that is going to take time. So I don't think we're going to see a sexual revolution in the Arab world. What I think we may see, however, is a sexual re-evaluation. And by this I mean that young people, all people now across the Arab region, are starting to ask very hard questions of politics. Now, politics was one of what we call in the Arab world the red lines. Topics you're not supposed to challenge in word or deed. Okay, so now you can't get people to stop talking about politics and questioning authority in many countries in the Arab region. The other red line is religion. And now people are starting to ask some questions, particularly as politics and religion are entwined in many countries in the Arab region with the rise of political Islam. Well, guess what the third red line is? It's sex. And I think that with the new spirit that many people in the region now feel that it is their right to speak out and it is their right to be heard, I hope that my book and all the efforts of all these groups working on the ground, that they will encourage people to ask these same hard questions of sexual life and the sexual taboos we now face. Because at the end of the day, achieving justice and freedom and equality and dignity and privacy and autonomy inside the bedroom is key to achieving it outside the bedroom in political, economic, and social life. Because the political and the sexual, they are natural bedfellows. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciated this wonderful discussion that you had here, but I thoroughly enjoyed this. I read this on a plane, and I thought, well, first of all, I wanted a paper bag to cover the front cover because the fellow beside me kept staring at me at, the very provocative title. But I couldn't put it down. I thought, I'm gonna go through the first part, and then I'll put it down and watch a movie here and there, but couldn't stop. So it's a good thing it was a long flight from BC, so the whole thing was read one sitting. I loved it. It was fantastic, and thoroughly enjoyed so many parts of this. One of the things that I can tell your audience that doesn't come out here because you really have to read the book is how beautifully written this is.
Oh, Besma, that's so kind.
There are so many double entendres in this book that, okay, so the cover is one of them, which,
Should I tell you a bit about the cover? Can I explain?
I was going to, but please do. Yes.
Okay, so the cover. There are different covers in different parts of the world.
Yes.
And this is the British cover. And, right, it's actually based on a piece of Islamic art, which one very keen observer in Australia described it having a labial tweak. So I have to tell you, and my apologies to my father, but so I showed this to my father, and my father, who is extremely knowledgeable of Islamic history and art, and my father was saying, yes, I can see the motif and this and the verdant motif, and I said, Dad, do you not see what's at the center of the drawing? And he said, oh, and I said, Dad, you trained as a gynecologist. Do you not see what's at the center of this image? But that was not considered appropriate for a Canadian audience. There is an American cover, which is
Even
quite...
more provocative.
It is, and was deemed inappropriate as well. So my publishers in Canada were tremendous, and they said to me, Shereen, do you have any ideas? And so I said to them, look, if you go back in the history of the Arab region, there was a long history of writing about sex, Arabic erotica. And these books are absolutely fantastic. And one of the books I quote in Sex and the Citadel, the English translation is the Encyclopedia of Pleasure. It comes from the 10th or 11th century Baghdad. And I have to tell you, there is nothing in the joy of sex, cosmopolitan, even U-porn, that these books didn't cover over a millennium ago. But what's really interesting is that we used to have whole dictionaries of sex in Arabic. And it's a measure of how closed the Arab world has become today, in that the only language that we really have to talk about sex is often the language of the street.
Yeah.
And many people in the Arab world will feel more comfortable if they know another language to talk about sex in French or English, or even in Hebrew if they're Palestinians living in Israel, than they will using Arabic. And so I went back to one of these books, and we found some of these lost words for sex, and I gave them to an extremely talented calligrapher called Wissam Shaukat. He's Iraqi, based in Dubai. And I asked him, Wissam, if I give you these words, could you create the body of a woman from them? And that's what he did.
Yeah. Yeah. Lovely. Well, I'm going to take it even one step further, because when I first read the title, I thought, oh, this is a play on Sex in the City, right? Sex in the City, Sex in the Citadel.
No, really?
Well, that's what you're supposed to say. Yes, you're supposed to say yes. And then only at the very end you discover, which never dawned on me, that Citadel in Arabic has a double entendre as well. So Citadel in Arabic is called Ala, which is actually the citadel proper, but it also means take your clothes off. So here you have another double entendre in the title itself. It was just beautiful.
Yeah, but the key was the citadel as a metaphor.
Absolutely.
Really.
Absolutely.
For this almost, as I say, impregnable fortress we put around sex and marriage. And the question is, what are we going to do? And at the end of the day, through all my travels and all my discussions, even with the most ardent activists who want to see change, no one is talking about pulling down the citadel.
Yeah.
They're talking about building out the citadel so that we can take in the more challenging populations like unwed mothers, for example. Or we can cover more difficult terrain like sexuality education. And then maybe in the decades to come, we find we don't need the citadel, but we pull it down from the inside. Yeah. And that's how change occurs in the Arab region.
That's amazing. Well, I mean, I must say the writing is, for lack of a better term, all I could think of was witty. And I thought, as a political economist, perhaps, I mean, this is what, at least with The Economist, is sort of the training of the witty writer. Did that have anything to do with sort of your writing style? Because it sure sort of has that, again, that great wittiness to the words and language that you use.
I have to say that my writing style owes much to my wayward youth reading P.G. Wodehouse and Jane Austen. So that's where the style comes from. But certainly my time at The Economist gave me a tremendous training in how to write in an accessible fashion, but also how to combine anecdote, personal stories, with facts and figures. And so I'm really delighted that it's worked and it's made an impression upon you. That's
well,
great.
I mean, sort of one sort of voice of wisdom. I mean, there's so many characters in this book that you just sort of, the sisters. I mean, there's so many people that, now I just want to go to the Middle East and find them. But, the one voice of wisdom that always comes out is your Nana, your grandmother.
Yes.
Who sort of has, every once in a while, it's that great classic Arabic saying, a few that I knew, a few I didn't know, but they resonate in such a beautiful way. And I'd love for you to just kind of reflect on that, if you don't mind.
So my father would always bring up these amthal, these proverbs from my grandmother. And I asked my father, Dad, these are wonderful. And they say so much about not just our family, but Egyptian culture.
Absolutely.
And please, could you write them down? Because it would be good to have them as a repository of wisdom, if you like.
Absolutely. And
so a couple of weeks later, I got a call from my father. And he said, I've been writing them down. And I now have over 900. So, but they're great. And the reason I included them in the book is that I wanted to point out the very trammeled vision that we now have of sex, that everything is forbidden. It's so narrow. is simply not the history. It's not our history in Egypt. And this narrowness on sex is a reflection of a closing down in almost all domains of thought due to the rise of Islamic conservatism in Egypt as a response, in my opinion, in large part to political dictatorship over the decades. And that you don't need to look back to the Encyclopedia of Pleasure and back to the Abbasid period to see this openness. You can even see it in the time of our parents and our grandparents. And so my grandmother's rather pithy sayings really encapsulate that. And I don't want to give too much away, but she really had a gift for the bon mot. So
she sure did. And if you need another 800, I have a grandmother who could pile on a few as well. They're really your Nenda's voice every once in a while is just that angel that sort of comes and gives the words of wisdom from an Arab woman. A genuine sort of Arab voice was really quite lovely.
Thank
really
you. And she's sadly she has passed away, but I'm delighted to see that she has an entry in the index, Aziza Nuna. Author's grandmother, so she would have been pleased with that. I think
she has lots to be proud of for sure. Can I ask you? I mean, this book to me, I love the fact that it weaves again the personal stories. I mean, you have these amazing characters and individuals, strong women. I call them strong, even in moments where some of us could look and read parts of this and think, oh my gosh, I can only imagine your face having to hear this. You mean. The young woman in Morocco who believes that she had an immaculate conception, for example.
I think we need to maybe explain that one.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a young woman called Faiza, whom I met in Casablanca. And I met her through one of these terrific NGOs that are trying to find space for unwed mothers. So this particular group is called Solidarité Féminine. And Faiza told me the story of how she came to get pregnant and give birth. And so what happened to Faiza is that she comes from a small town in southern Morocco. She had essentially a one-night stand with a friend of a friend. She didn't know she was pregnant. This speaks to the inadequacy of sexuality education. Although Faiza is highly educated, she is a high school graduate. Her mother became alarmed at her symptoms, sent her to a doctor in a town several hundred kilometers away because they're worried about family shame. She died, she was confirmed her pregnancy. She came back. When her pregnancy became too advanced, she had to leave home because she was concerned about violence from her father or brothers. Honor crimes are a shadowy subject in the Arab world, but they do happen. So she went to Casablanca because she heard about these NGOs. And when she got to a hospital, a man told her, yes, I can introduce you to one of these groups. Please come this way. He took her to a room, locked the door, and for 3 hours tried to rape her. And as Faiza said to me, the day that I delivered, it was he who was in my head, a fear that I could never forget. Faiza actually had a happy outcome to this. She found an NGO. They managed to help get her through the pregnancy and delivery. Now, sex outside of marriage is technically illegal in Morocco, as it is in many countries in the region. But if you're under the umbrella of one of these NGOs, the police turn a blind eye. They helped her get a vocational training. So she was training to become a beautician. They helped her find a place to live. They helped her stay with her son, which is key, because in orphanages across Egypt, for example, we have them filled with kids who come from so-called illegitimate relations. So the key to these NGOs are to try to keep the kids with their mothers. And most importantly, they try to reconcile the mothers with their own families, because family is really important. So Faiza is telling me this hugely moving story, and at the end of it, she says, but I am still a virgin. I have 2 medical certificates to prove that I am a virgin. So what had happened is that Faiza became pregnant through superficial sexual relations, and she didn't know enough to realize that someone has to be using contraception. And what was amazing is that she was so insistent on this point. It was her honor, her family's honor. But what was most interesting is that she defined virginity as a piece of anatomy. Her hymen was intact. And this speaks to a bigger problem across the Arab region, which is the disconnect between appearance and reality. It's not what you do, it's what you're seen to be doing.
Absolutely.
And so, as I say in the book, you know, two millennia on, virgin births are still a fact of life in the Middle East.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I loved about the book is that you really gave people these voices. In fact, so much so that I noticed you never tried to summarize what they say and correct their English. I mean, it literally word for word. And at some point I thought to myself, this is so familiar because I know so many people who talk like this. But at one point I thought, wait a minute, that's grammatically incorrect. But obviously I understood every word. You didn't try to change their voice, which I thought was a beautiful touch.
Okay.
There was something very genuine about that that I thought that I would relay. I mean, the other thing I want to ask you, the audience of this book, I mean, everybody here is going to leave and buy a book. So I want everybody here to buy the book. But is this going to be translated in Arabic? Because this is a treasure for so many people of the region who need to read this. And I'm wondering whether you're considering an Arabic translation.
I'd love to see it translated into Arabic. I have to say that when I started writing this book, it was partially for me because as someone who is half Egyptian with a family in the region and who is Muslim, I really wanted to use the process of writing this book as a way of connecting to my heritage. So it was in part for me, and it was in part also for people outside the Arab region, so that you could come to understand people at their most intimate and most human. By the time I finished the book, however, I was writing it for people inside the region, because I realized that many of them felt isolated in their problems. They didn't know the history.
Yes.
They didn't know the religion. So if we speak specifically about Islam, they did not know that there are alternative interpretations around many issues to do with women, but in particular to do with sexuality. And that these conservative, narrow interpretations that were presented are not the only voice, and that there have been other voices in the past. So I wanted them to be aware of that. And I also wanted them to use this book to start asking, as I say, the questions that need to be asked of personal and intimate life. You're absolutely right, the book needs to be translated into Arabic. I would love to see it in Arabic. It is proving something of a challenge to find a publisher in the Arab region willing to take on this book. Just because we have more freedom of expression and people feel emboldened doesn't mean that the apparatus of state censorship has gone away. So there's an element of that, but also because I think that publishers are wary. How will people respond? But I think certainly in all my conversations, and certainly the feedback I'm receiving from colleagues and others in the region suggests that young people are thirsting for this information. So my dream is that 5 years from now, I walk into the house of Azza. Azza is one of the women who's in the early chapter in the book. She's married, and her life and the life of her family really illuminated so many of the problems within marriage inside and outside the bedroom. So my dream is I go into Azza's living room, I see Sex and the Citadel in Arabic on her coffee table, and more to the point, I see her teenage daughter on the computer, on my website, sexandthecitadel.com, and she's not only reading it, she's actually contributing to it. And if all that were to pass, then I would consider Sex and the Citadel a job well done.
Well, it is definitely a job well done already. But I do hope that the Arab world gets to read this, because I think, and I'm only just repeating what you say, but I have to say it, I love the fact that you gave life to Islamic debates. We're unfortunately, even in the contemporary times, unfortunately, certain individuals take the megaphone and they sort of dominate sort of very one interpretive view of a lot of things. And what you do here, I think, is being able to reference not only historical texts, but also refer to modern day preachers and modern day interpretists to see that, in fact, there are different ways of looking at it that is very intelligent. At one point at the beginning you say this is not academic, but as an academic, I thoroughly felt, well-informed leaving, but yet it was these little things, the voice of Nun every once in a while, and Azza's personal story, and then the facts. Coming out as a scientist is evident here too, because you don't feel like you're just getting stories, you're also getting a lot of really great information. So, it's very few books that get to balance all of those criteria, and I must say it's just done so beautifully. So I thank you, and I do hope that people in the Middle East get a chance to read this in Arabic, because there's so much to that. One of the things that you talk about that I think also stands out to me is how little public space there is. I mean, this is something that, you know, the picture of the young Egyptians on the Corniche, for example, I mean, you could see there is this thirst for just public spaces to be real. And, you know, when you see something like Tahrir Square, which is really emblematic of, you know, young people taking a public space and making their own. I can't help but wonder, I mean, you know, you said that this took 5 years to write. And I wonder, were you going to wrap this up by coincidence before the Arab Spring and said, wait a minute, I think I have to delay?
Have you been speaking to my publisher?
No. Because, I mean, I think it would have been a great book before the Arab Spring, but it's a phenomenal book after the Arab Spring. And I wonder if that actually might have been a key objective, to actually wait till, you know, till the end of November of last year to just say, done.
Well, it's a very perceptive observation. The book was started in 2007, 2008. And originally, I was going to submit the manuscript in 2010. But I was delayed slightly. And then, of course, in 2011, there was the small matter of uprising across the Arab region. And so that put my research into a very different light, because the connection between the political and the sexual, which had been almost academic when I started, has now become a real prospect moving forward. And so I went back, I re-interviewed many of the people I had spoken to before 2011 to see changes in attitudes. And so it really gave the book impetus, and I think a relevance to today and how events are playing out on the ground. For example, I talk in the book about the coming trials and tribulations that the Muslim Brotherhood would face. Now, my book, those pages closed in November 2012. I didn't realize those trials and tribulations were going to come quite as fast. And so it's very interesting that a number of almost speculations I had in the book about what would happen after the uprising are really playing out now in streets and squares across Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere in the region. So the book remains a work in progress, and it's the website really that gives it additional life now, because if you go to my website, you'll find updates, the developments that are going on related to the subject of sexuality in the Arab world. And I certainly encourage anyone who's in the audience or who's online, this is not a one-way street. I created this website to encourage people to contribute to the information base around sexuality in the region, or indeed anyone who has an interest in region. So you, for example, with your tremendous expertise in politics and economics, to go to the website and help bring out those connections between personal and sexual life and sexual rights and political and economic rights, that would be a huge contribution to broadening the debate. So it's for you and others who have an interest, whether it's academic or just personal.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's open it to the audience then, because I think it would be a great opportunity for us to get some questions. I'd love to, please make your way to, there's several microphones on the side if you'd like to ask a question. We have one from Samantha Online, who asks, where do you anticipate changing attitudes towards sex will first occur in the region?
I'm not sure that it's a geographical question, Samantha. I think it's more of a thematic issue. So if we look, for example, at what's happening around sexual violence, so certainly in these spectacular cases of attacks near Tahrir Square in downtown Cairo, as I've said, we see people speaking out, women speaking out in a way they never would have done a decade ago.
Absolutely.
Going on national television saying, I have been raped, this is wrong, this is against Islam, and it is my right to be in the public space. And what is most amazing is that alongside these women are men who are supporting them. And so we are starting to see moves around what I could best describe as negative sexual rights. So these are the questions of freedom from coercion, violence, and discrimination. So we see people now challenging on questions of sexual harassment, sexual violence, incest. And that's terrific, and that's where we need to be addressing these questions. The harder step is to move to these positive sexual rights. So, for example, the right to information, the right to express yourself, and the right to generate information around sexuality. The right to marry whom you choose, when you choose. The right to have children as you choose, or not to have children. So I can tell you in Egypt, for example, when you get married, you have to produce a child by your first wedding anniversary, or preferably 9 months after the wedding day. And if you don't, it is a really big problem. And it's not just your problem, it's not just your husband's problem, it's your family's problem. It is such a big deal that I know young women in Cairo who are starting fertility treatment after 6 months of marriage because they are concerned that they have not yet conceived. Now, the definition of primary infertility, the medically accepted definition, is a year of productive intercourse and you haven't conceived. Now, I've got to tell you, I really wonder how productive the intercourse is in the Arab region, given how little young people know about sex going into marriage. And yet there is this enormous pressure. So these positive sexual rights are not yet on the agenda. But first things first, at least the discussion has started.
Well, in your chapter on Desperate Housewives, which I really enjoyed very much, I mean, there's another little interesting title there, but you know, you really give voice to these women who are under so much pressure. I mean, you know, it's incredible. You know, they feel they need to be super, I mean, you know, these are common problems even in the West, but, you know, added sort of burdens of wanting to please their husbands and the sort of their shop for lingerie and all the lingerie described were just horrendous. I've seen them in Cairo shops myself. So, you know, unfortunately, they're not far off from reality. They're very tacky, you know, weird kinds of pieces that are supposed to generate some sort of hotness in the bedroom, but I don't know how.
So I can tell you that when I got married, my husband was very disappointed that I opted for some rather discreet and tasteful lingerie as opposed to going shopping in downtown Cairo for, I don't know, a bra which when you push it plays Old MacDonald at a farm.
I have a pair of pajamas that have ducks on it that is very attractive from Cairo.
Really? Okay. Well, interesting stuff. But the important point to keep in mind about that lingerie is that many women I spoke with in Egypt did not see this lingerie as a tool of male oppression. They did not see it turning them into these frothy, frilly sexual objects. For them, it was a tool of empowerment. And the reason for that is that many women feel embarrassed to initiate sexual activity. They cannot actually articulate this because they are afraid that their husbands will see them as bad women. And yet they have sexual desire. And so one of the interesting aspects is that they turn to this lingerie, and for them, it allows them to express their sexual needs. And so throughout the book, I'm very careful to show that often people go about achieving happiness in their sexual lives differently. And in fact, the essence of sexual rights is the right to a happy, pleasurable, and satisfying sexual life, free of, as I said, violence, discrimination, and coercion. But it's important to keep in mind that people define happiness differently. And they may go about achieving it differently. It doesn't mean they don't want it. It just means that it comes in a different context. And I've tried to make that clear throughout the book because in particular, some outsiders will look to practices in the Arab world and say, you know, they're backward or they're oppressive. But the key message I have is listen to the people on the ground. If this is what they want, very often they are not speaking out of ignorance. They are speaking out of information and along the grain of their culture and their religion. It behooves us to respect that and to help them achieve their goals.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that I noticed in the book that always came out, and you just handled it in a way that really gave respect to people's feelings, but also acknowledging powerful political forces that are often external, the sort of Frangi element that you talk about that is always brought up. So whether it's sort of Gulf attitudes, sexual attitudes from the Gulf that are being brought in, whether it's attitudes per se or the fact that you had separation in the family, you don't quite get into it, but you know the concept or the sort of hush-hush that there's a lot of homosexuality in the Gulf is sort of implied in a couple of chapters, but you don't go into it, which is okay. But I think that, you know, it's there. Sort of, again, there's a lot of, I think, a contemporary view that the Gulf has been, I think, a bad influence on Egyptian society. Similarly, sort of Lebanon as sort of another production of hypersexualized Lebanese actresses and singers, for example. But also what I loved is this one part where you get right into the bedroom and you start asking you know, the tension of Arab men sort of wanting that sexualized Western woman, you know, as the plaything, but not as the, you know, the mother of their children. And yet, you know, so they're torn. They want to fulfill, you know, a fulfilled and happy sexual life with their Arab wives, but yet they can't quite, I think, mesh the two images together. And the Arab women, similarly, they have sexual desires, they may know more, they become more experienced as they you know, go along in their marriages. At the same time, they feel that if they become too aggressive in the sexual relationship, then they also appeared as Western. And I loved how you handled that, because I think there's a real challenge there. And as we move forward in Arab society, that's something they're going to have to come to terms with, this love-hate relationship with everything that's Western.
Absolutely, and one of the points I make in the book is that it is not enough now in the Arab region essentially to define what we want in opposition to the West. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the last few weeks there have been these negotiations at the United Nations on a document about the elimination of violence towards women. It's under something called the Commission on the Status of Women. And the Muslim Brotherhood issued what could only be described as an apocalyptic official communique, saying that if you sign on to this document, mm-hmm. Muslim countries, then this will be the slippery slope to pornography, free love, prostitution, the end of the Arab world as we know it, and the collapse of Islam. Mm-hmm. And again, it's always defined in opposition to the West, that we don't want to be Western. But that is not a positive framework. We need to move beyond that and figure out how we are going to define the achievement of sexual rights in an Islamic framework, basically. Millions of people across the Arab world want to live their lives within the parameters of their faith, be it Islam or Christianity. What my book is trying to point out, in particular in the context of Islam, is that it is possible to find flexibility and realize many of these rights within an Islamic framework, so long as we have the freedom to think and act for ourselves. Yeah. And one of the reasons I keep bringing out the past is not because I'm some sort of sexual Salafi. I'm not suggesting we go back to some mythical golden age of sexual liberation in the past. No, it was a rough ride for many people in ages past. But what I'm suggesting is that our ancestors had an ability to reconcile the demands of the faith with the demands of the flesh. And we need to recapture that spirit and reinterpret it for our age.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things that I think would be interesting, if you don't mind also reflecting on, is how you find all these great references to history. I mean, did you go to an archive? Were you, you're surrounded by a number of scholars that you noticed you spoke about in Morocco and Tunisia. And also we have a comment or a question from Tom in Waterloo Online asking about challenges you had in conducting your research. So I'd love for you to sort of tell us a little bit about how you got these great sources, some of which I frankly hadn't heard of, but are just treasure troves, I think, of wisdom and great anecdotes.
Well, certainly a number of the sources of these great books of Arabic erotica are translated into English or French. And actually the history of Arab sexuality is well documented. And so I went back to those books. Some of them only exist as rare books in libraries, but fortunately I had access to them in London, England. And I have to say, in reading some of them, I attracted some pretty dirty looks from my fellow readers in the library, because I would just be laughing my head off. Basically, these books are so frank and so funny. Interestingly, many of these sources are not easily available in Arabic, and so actually reading them in French or English, it's so much easier. And again, in addition to hopefully my own book going into Arabic translation, I would love to see some of these really classics of Arabic erotica translated into a modern Arabic, because the problem is that many young people in particular, even if they did have access to these books, wouldn't understand the Arabic therein. I have to say that my father was a tremendous resource. His Arabic is vastly superior to my own. And I would call him, because some of these sources books are in Arabic, and I would say, Dad, I have a question about anal sex in Jahiliyyah, the period before the coming of Islam. Can you find a reference for me? And my poor mother, who very graciously tolerated years of very single-minded conversation over the dinner table. But it was immensely helpful in that regard. In terms of finding the people I spoke to, some of them are quite famous, they're well known, and effectively I just cold called them and said I'm interested in talking about the situation around sex and the taboos in the Arab world, and they were actually delighted to find someone who wanted to talk about these issues. And for the ordinary men and women, it was amazing because, of course, as we've discussed, there is a lot of silence and censorship around sex. But I didn't encounter a single person in the course of 5 years who refused to talk to me about sex. And in fact, my problem wasn't getting them to speak. My problem was getting them to stop talking.
If you can envision a next book, and I hope you continue with this, with this theme, is there something that comes to mind that you would like to further research?
I'm interested in men.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I need to qualify that. My husband may be watching the webcast. I'm interested in understanding what's happening with men in the Arab world, because so much of the focus rightly has been on women, their problems, their challenges, empowering women. And it's absolutely right that it should be that way. But we need to move on now and see men as more than just the pillars of the patriarchy. They're the problem. They're the ones who cause the violence and the dysfunction and the disorder and the exploitation. We need to bring them in. We need to understand how they are seeing change in the region. And really, we need to engage them in the process of really bringing a more level playing field inside and outside the bedroom. And so I'd love to explore the issues facing men and definitions of masculinity in the Arab region, especially in the shifting political, economic, and social order.
Well, I would very much love to read that book. I think that definitely there is a stronger female voice in this, and I think that's testament to sort of your ability to really, I think, get into the hearts and minds of so many women. I mean, really, the sisters that you talk about, I mean, you feel like they're in every Middle East family, and their stories and some of their trials and tribulations are so familiar. So thank you for bringing that to life, and I look forward to seeing the next book, and hopefully we'll have you back here at CIGI. So thank you very much, Shereen El Feki.
Thank you.
Before we adjourn, first of all, some words of thanks for Dr. El Feki for the exceptional presentation and discussion this evening, and Besma for moderating so well. I think we all have a better understanding now of changing sexual attitudes and behaviors in the Arab world, that it's not so much a sexual revolution, but perhaps a sexual reevaluation that's going on. And I want to applaud your courage, Shereen, not only for crossing the red line yourself in engaging this topic, but encouraging others to discuss and engage and ask questions in the Arab world, a brave thing to do. And I hope that your dream comes true of seeing this book translated into Arabic and engaging a new generation of Arab youth. I want to thank you for concluding your month-long whirlwind book tour of the world here at home in Waterloo, and for inviting your parents here tonight. I think that's wonderful. And, Besma made a very good point of, made an emphasis on the point about how well the book is written, and that doesn't surprise me at all, given how well you speak. So thank you for speaking here tonight. I just want to remind our audience that Dr. El Feki's book, Sex in the Citadel, is available in the CIGI Campus lobby for sale immediately after this. And sometimes the audience will come up and ask to engage the speaker and speak to our speakers down here. I would ask you tonight to go right out to the lobby, because we're inviting you to stick around, have some refreshments with us, meet the author out in the lobby. So please proceed right out there, and we'll all get together and chat further, and be an opportunity for you to pick up the book. So thank you for coming tonight. I'd like to thank our online audience as well for engaging. The video from tonight's webcast will be posted online if you'd like to refer other people to it later. And I just want to mention our next two events in the CIGI Auditorium. On April 16th, we have Internet pioneer Steve Crocker coming to Canada and speaking here in Waterloo about the future of Internet freedom and governance. This presentation is entitled When Less is More, the Past and Future of Internet Governance. And on April 24th, Isabel Ortiz will present a social protection floor for an inclusive recovery. At this event, she'll address the topic of rising inequalities in the world and the idea of social protection policies for the global economy. Isabel is based at Columbia University following a distinguished career with UNICEF, the Asian Development Bank, and the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And both of those events begin at 7 p.m. So be sure to register for our events newsletter for information on these and all other upcoming lectures. And thanks again to CIGI's event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Thank you for coming tonight and a safe journey home.
It is that I should have written a book about sex, let alone sex in as far flung a part of the world as the Arab region. To give you a sense of exactly how far I have come, let me read from the beginning of Sex in the Citadel. Sorry, we're having a slight problem with the visuals. Okay, great. What is it? 6 pairs of dark eyes stared at me, or rather at the small purple rod in my hand. It's a vibrator, I answered, in English, racking my brain for the right Arabic word. A thing that makes fast movements came to mind, but as that could equally well apply to a hand mixer, I decided to stick with my mother tongue to minimize what I could sense was rising confusion in the room. One of the women, curled up on a divan beside me, began to unpin her hijab, a cascade of black hair falling down her back as she carefully put her headscarf to one side. "What does it do?" she asked. "Well, it vibrates," I added, taking a sip of mint tea.
And interact with one another are less immediately obvious. We're pleased to have as our keynote speaker tonight, Shereen El Feki. She's spent the past several years examining sexual attitudes and behaviors in the Arab world, attitudes closely linked to trends in religion, culture, politics, and economics. Dr. El Feki, who was born in the United Kingdom and raised in Canada, including living here in Waterloo region, is a writer, broadcaster, and academic who started her professional career in medical science with a PhD in molecular immunology from the University of Cambridge. She's an award-winning journalist with The Economist, a presenter with Al Jazeera English, and is vice chair of the UNs Global Commission on HIV and Law. Her new book, titled Sex in the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World, was published this month, and copies will be sold in the CIGI Campus lobby this evening. Serving as our discussant tonight is Dr. Besma Momani, CIGI Senior Fellow and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and the Balsley School of International Affairs. You may recognize Besma's name from her opinion pieces in the Huffington Post, Toronto Star, and Globe and Mail, or her regular appearances on CTV and CBC News as one of Canada's leading commentators on politics and economics in the Middle East. So now please help me to welcome our keynote speaker, Shereen El Feki.
Well, my thanks to Fred for his very kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank Rohinton Medhora and Colleen Fitzpatrick and their colleagues here at CIGI for inviting me to speak this evening. I've been on tour with my book for about a month now, and it's been launched in the UK and Australia and the US and Germany and Canada. And I've spoken at some rather unusual places during this time. In Los Angeles, I was on stage with a stand-up comedian at the Silent Movie Theater. Sex, humor, silence, the symbolism speaks volumes. In New York, I was in discussion with a former call girl turned novelist at the Museum of Sex. So I can tell you tonight, this is the most distinguished venue I've had an opportunity to speak in, and you're by far the largest audience. So my thanks to you here in the auditorium for taking the time out of your busy schedules, and also my thanks to everyone who's online. I greatly appreciate your interest. As Fred said, tonight has a special significance for me. This is my last.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. I'd like to thank CIGI's public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support in making the signature lecture series a success. Besides the audience here, we also have a global audience watching on the live webcast. And following this evening's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either the live audience here at the mics at the sides, or if you're online in our chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to the moderator on stage. This evening, we take a unique look at how the Middle East has undergone and continues to see important changes. Over the past 2 years, countries in the region, from Tunisia and Libya to Egypt and Syria, have experienced historic internal struggles and upheavals for political change. But what of the ongoing changes within Arab societies not demanded by obvious revolution, progress in the level of discourse within civil society, and in the ways that men and women...
Last event of my book tour, and it's fitting that it should be in the place where I started. I grew up in Waterloo, just around the corner from University of Waterloo. I went to high school here. I took classes at U of W and WLU. I have to say it's really good to be home. There are many people here in the audience tonight who helped me along my way, former teachers, friends, students, and I'd like to thank them. But in particular, there are two people I'd like to single out for mention, and they are my parents, Dr. Gamal and Mrs. Shereen El Feki. Dad, I know, ma'am, you can't stand very well, but my father, please stand. This book would not have been possible without them, and I don't mean that in the sense that I wouldn't have been possible without them, but really they were instrumental in their encouragement and their support at every step of the way of taking this book from a glimmer in my eye to something that you can actually buy outside if you'd like to contribute to the Distressed First-Time Authors Fund. Now, those of you in the audience who remember me from my youth when I was all bad hair and geek chic will appreciate how improbable